I've been asked to say something about the ONS longitudinal study, which, as we've heard, is one of the other LSs in the UK. And so I'm going to say a little bit about the sample and try and think about some of the differences between the ONS LS and the SLS. So very broadly, what is it? It's a 1% sample of the population with linked records. In that respect, it's similar to the SLS, albeit with a smaller sample. If we think about that in a little bit more detail, in the ONS LS, and the name I accept is a little bit awkward, we refer to it as the LS, as if it's the only one, and of course it isn't. Users often refer to it as the England and Wales LS for the sake of clarity and lack of ambiguity, although that's not a formal title. So we have 4 birth dates, giving a 1.1% sample of the population, and our data cover 5 censuses from 1971 onwards. We have linked civil registration and NHS data, and we can also think about this in terms of the structure of the data. It's a relational database made up of a number of separate tables. When someone applies to use the LS, what they're asking for is for one of our support officers to extract a sample of data from that relational database for them to work on. This image was produced by ONS for one of their presentations. And what this is showing is taking the 1971 sample, so 1% of the population of England and Wales in 1971, and looking at what happened to them. So the yellow dots in this are people who are still alive and captured in successive censuses. The sort of white dots are people who've died, and a little bit hard to see, the green dots in between those are people who've emigrated and left the sample that way. Because of the nature of the sample, it's collected in England and Wales, people can leave the sample both through international emigration and through moving to Scotland or to Northern Ireland. I think it's also quite useful for us to think about stories we can tell about this data. We can't discuss individuals in the LS or the SLS or NILS, but we can think of aggregate stories. And one of the things that interests me about this view of the 1971 sample is the top 3.5 rows of the left-hand column, if we think of them in age order. Those are people who were born in the 19th century. So it's interesting to think of this as data that's going back quite a long way. This is looking at the data from the other direction. On the right-hand side, we've got the 2011 sample, and it's disaggregated by how people have joined that sample. So the red dots are people who were born and then first registered in 2011. No, that's wrong, isn't it? People who were born and captured in the LS. The green dots in the middle are people who've entered through immigration, and the yellow dots are people who've been captured in previous censuses. The columns leading up to that are the people who were present in 2011 and also captured in earlier censuses. So a brief resume of some of the things we've done in our current funding round since 2012. When we were starting in 2012 under the current phase of Celsius, we were looking towards the link of the 2011 sample and beta test projects to test that sample. We were looking at what our users wanted. We were thinking about synthetic data, and I think Fiona's going to talk about that in a little while. Since then, we've been looking forward to the 2021 sample, and we've also been doing all sorts of training and user engagement. I wanted to give a brief summary of some of that. So we've got a list of beta test projects that were run on the 2011 sample here. And we can think now, towards 2021, of some of the things we might want to do with that sample. And one of the things that I think will be an interesting kind of natural experiment in 2021 is to consider the effect of Brexit. And in the data up to 2011, we've got a whole load of people who were born in the EU, and we can see whether they're still there in 2021 or whether they're not. We've got a data dictionary that we've developed, and in conjunction with calls, we've also contributed to a data dictionary that crosses all three of the studies, and also adds various additional content. And we've done a lot of dissemination of research and information about the LS at different conferences and to different audiences. And one of the things we've tried to do is to recognise the diversity of interest in the LS and try and talk at a relatively large number of different locations. So those are government agencies, academic conferences, various things. Sort of in the middle on the right-hand side, ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they're developing their own longitudinal data sets. So we've talked to them about our experience, not just of using longitudinal data, but the practical elements of running a service for users of longitudinal data. In terms of our engagement, one of the things we've tried to do is engage new audiences in longitudinal data, beyond our sort of usual set of usual suspects. So one of the things we did in 2015, on October the 21st, which is the date to which people travel forward in Back to the Future from 1985, we had a showing of the film Back to the Future, and we preceded that with a talk about the LS, thinking about what the LS tells us about time travel. What it tells us about time travel is quite interesting, because we've got a set of people that we follow forward through time at 10-year intervals, but we can also take those same people and look back into their past. And so that image is a list of sort of write-in options for religion. Religion's quite interesting. We can take people's religion that they completed as part of the census form in 2001 or 2011, and then look at those people earlier in the sequence, at a time before religion was a question that was asked in the census. So we can travel back in time a little bit with these people as well. So what we did with Back to the Future is we considered the film, and in the film we've got Marty McFly in 1985 as a teenager living with his parents, and then in one of the sort of parallel timelines we see him again in 2015, except now he's a parent and living with his children. And we can do exactly the same sort of comparison with longitudinal data. And in the film, there's a sort of question of how much education Marty has and how much his family has. So what we did is to compare the highest level of educational qualification that someone's parents had in 1981 with the level of education that they had in 2011. And so we see in the first column, if your parents in the 1980s had a degree, then you're really likely to have a degree as well. And on the right-hand side, we see that if your parents didn't have any qualifications, it's still the case that a degree is the most likely outcome for you. Although the difference between that and a low level of GCSE or equivalent education is very, very slim. So some of that's a hopeful story, but there's still quite a lot to be done in thinking about social mobility and education as we see it in the LS. We've also done work with colleagues in Wales. So this is from a presentation we did in Wales, looking at what it means to be Welsh. And that sounds like a very easy question. But we posed that to some of our students that we talked to as an interesting way of thinking about longitudinal data. What does it take to be Welsh? Do you have to be born in Wales? Do you have to be born in Wales and stay there all your life, for some of your life? How long do you have to be in Wales? So we looked at people who were born in Wales and then present in varying numbers of censuses throughout their life, and established different sorts of populations and considered their outcomes. And that presentation went a little bit further, but as I said, I think this was an interesting way for us to talk to students about various characteristics and how they can change over time and over a relatively long sequence of observations. We're now making plans to look, as I said earlier, to the 2021 census and some of the things we might do there. We've got colleagues working in cohort studies, and we're interested in the way we can work, we can interact with the cohort studies. So the LSs can provide information about missing people in the cohort studies, and vice versa. They can lend strength to each other. Not in explicit exchange of samples, but in terms of weighting and understanding missingness and things like that. We're interested in the way that small area statistics change over time and how we can add contextual data to the longitudinal study. So we're interested in adding small area observations of air pollution, crime statistics, other environmental data, locational data. We're interested in adding things like green area data, green space data, on a small area level, so people can compare those to demographic characteristics as well. One of the things I'm interested in is looking at the mode of completion in the census, whether you use the internet or whether you used a paper form, and whether there are differences in those sorts of populations, and whether that says anything about engagement in the census and other instruments over time. And we're also interested in linking the LS with administrative data. That's something that Northern Ireland and Scotland have done better than England and Wales, and we could debate the reasons for that, but we haven't got very much time now. But we are trying to get that data added, and it's the thing our users ask us for, and we do recognise that that's a need, and we are trying to address that. Finally, those are just some acknowledgements for the data that was in the slides.